Okay. So yeah, I'm Marie, just from Germany, and we're doing this podcast about just general politics to kind of encourage young voters to get involved and kind of form their own opinion. So so I was doing this episode on the future of work, and I love the topic personally. So I was like really excited, and then I started thinking about what an like virtual politician would look like, and found you guys. So thank you so much for taking the time. Yeah.
Thank you.
And Nick, I was messaging with you, right? And then
yes, correct. Yep.
Cool. And hello to everyone else too.
Yeah. So we have Martin and Andrew as well, and we're all based in New Zealand.
Cool. How's the weather? It's probably really good, isn't it?
Yeah. Not too bad.
Should I just start asking you the questions?
Yeah, just lead off, and we'll and Martin's more on the technical side of things, and Andrew and I are more on the policy and some of the thinking, contextual thinking around the idea.
Cool. So how did you come up with this idea? Like, what made you develop SAM?
Yeah, there was probably about 3 years ago, there was quite a big push in New Zealand around this sort of emerging sector of GovTech. How can you use technology in a way that actually solves problems for governments delivering services? It's obviously a national movement, and that really provided us with a bit of a platform to thinking, well, actually, let's look at the political system itself and how it works and how policy is developed. And increasing data from around the world that's showing that actually democracy is starting to struggle, or it's getting flooded by complexity. And so Andrew was involved in as chief executive of a leading software development company in Wellington. And so he and I sort of teamed up and said, hey, what about this sort of concept? I'd spent some time over the years sort of in and out of, quite senior strategic roles within various government agencies. I was a year and a half in the Department of the Prime Minister and Cabinet when Helen Clark was Prime Minister, sort of providing input at that level. And so I sort of, between us, we got to see actually the realities of how government works. And I think it's pretty clear that it's a very old system. It was developed, over 200 years ago. And so it hasn't really been updated. So if you contextualize it, Westminster democracy, or the concept of liberal democracy that we're living, hasn't really been updated since we had, messenger pigeons and stuff like that. And obviously society and the nature of society has changed significantly. So really the big question for us was, how could technology serve a purpose to actually make political engagement better?
And I guess from my perspective, I was concerned by the underrepresentation of young people in the voting system. So in New Zealand, if you're less than 18 years old, you can't vote. Over and above that, people that are in prison in New Zealand also can't vote. So when you look at a country like New Zealand, there's actually quite a large amount of our population can't vote, and then there's quite a large amount of the population that don't vote. And that I don't know how representative that is for the rest of the world, but certainly we all know that there's a large amount of the world's population that is, of a younger age that's not allowed to vote, and we can see the protests that young people have made on the streets in order to have their voice heard. But of course, that's quite an old-fashioned way of having your voice heard. So the idea was, could we galvanize those people across the whole world and get them to engage in politics?
What is the, just a follow-up question, what is the, because you said young people can't vote and a large part of the population doesn't vote, what's like the general voting like participation in New Zealand? Like how many people?
New Zealand, it's still really high. We're amongst the highest in the world, but the number of people not voting is actually increasing as well.
Okay.
You know, was slightly different this last election that we just had because obviously it occurred during COVID. So, you know, most people were sort of like locked at home and they had nothing to do but vote, you know. So, but you know, the general trend is sort of like, again, New Zealand is similar to what's been experienced with, you know, other countries around the world, that generally the trend is a negative trend around democracy. And, you know, ironically, it's at a time where more than anything, if you think about some of these, you know, mega issues, climate change, inequality, you know, et cetera, we actually need democracy to be performing at its top level, not actually decreasing. So, you know, from our perspective, we see there's a gap between, I guess, the ideals of democracy and actually how it's being executed and how it's playing out in society.
Okay, and that's how you came up with the idea of SAM. So that made
well, I mean, I think between us, we're like action people. We would rather give something a go rather than sit down and write a report about it, you know. And so obviously, you know, between us, we've done various technology development over time, and so we had the audacity or whatever to actually give it a shot. And you know, SAM was really an experiment, you know. So again, without going in there and thinking that we had the solutions, SAM is more about creating a space for us to ask this question: is like, is there a role? Is there an increasing role for artificial intelligence, you know, and new technological mechanisms to actually assist in the practice of politics? And I think the answer for us has been a resounding yes, and this interview is a good example of it. But I think, you know, we were totally blown away by the level of international interest that we got in the project.
So how does the process work? Because I'm not like someone who's very, like, obviously I know how to use a computer, but that's, you know, about as far as it goes. So how does the process work of developing something like this?
So Martin, do you want to speak a little bit about our thinking?
Certainly. So I got involved in a project after version 1, which is the one that was attracting so much attention. So what we're now looking at is how do we actually get to the point where an AI can interpret what people are saying and trying to figure out what the meaning is of what they're saying. Extremely complicated because that involves a lot of interpretation of intent. Whereas if you look at normal text-based or voice-based interactions with a computer, technically all you have to do is figure out, is this user wanting to, and then choose from a list of known things that you're going to do, for example, switch on the light or order a book online. So what we are looking at is the complexity of this is extremely high. That's why we're currently in a mode of carefully selecting how do we progress forward. Up until now, the development of something like this is a matter of identifying what are people wanting to talk about, and then figuring out how do we lead them through a series of questions in order to kind of prompt them to give us information about what's of interest to them. And we then store that interest to see what people's opinions are on the various topics, to get a bit of an idea of where people sit, what the political spectrum is where people operate with regards to SAM.
And what we started to see with version 1 was the simple sort of like step of someone asking a question and us going through quite a manual process of answering that question. You suddenly see that memory starts to occur because you only need to ask that question once. And so you start to see like an exponential, you know, capability of it. And so obviously it was very rudimentary, it was very basic, but it was significant enough to actually give people a little bit of an idea about what's possible. What we're doing now with version 2, as Martin's saying, is like looking, how can we add a little bit of a complexity to it? So certainly, I mean, this is a little bit like technology. If you believe in data, if you believe in the facts, if you look at the practice of politics itself, it's sort of this weird combination of, you know, data, facts, and then sentiment. So obviously politicians won't necessarily release the facts or talk about the facts if they think it might risk their ability of getting re-elected, for example, and so what we're looking at with technology is how can we make that process of sort of like smashing sentiment against the facts something that's more transparent and has a memory behind it, and hopefully can lift everyone up. Politicians, citizens, the performance of government agency, everyone gets lifted up. I think at the moment, a huge amount of assumptions are being made about really what people really truly care about, and also assumptions being made about what really truly the political system can deliver on. So for me, climate change is a major motivator for a lot of the work that I do. And I'm just feeling tired after 30 years of conferences and policy papers and blah, blah, blah. It's like, it's just got worse. So at a certain point, you need to say, you know what? The current political engagement around this particular issue has failed. The political systems globally and even individually in individual countries has failed. So let's try something new. Let's try a new way of actually building some consensus around an issue which is really, really complex. For a politician to get up and say, you know what, the last 30 years, we've wasted all our time, we've failed, we're not going to reach the target set by the IPCC, and the ramifications are the future generation who can't vote at the moment, you're going to have a really shit time. It's like, it takes Greta Thunberg to actually use language like that and provide that sort of leadership. The current politicians, doesn't matter where you look in the world, can't do that. So how can we use technology to sort of like create a framework for uncovering and providing a safer space for these sorts of issues to be discussed, I think is fundamental if we're going to maintain democracy.
And a crucial element in that whole spectrum is identifying how do we find facts? What is a fact? It's easy to say that 1 + 1 = 2, but that is not the same in everyone's opinion. So identifying what are the sources of actual facts and getting a way of consensus or acknowledgement of information as being factually true is at the fundament of that. Without those facts, and we leave it up to the interpretation of politicians, like Nick says, where they only release those facts that are true to them, that biases the whole conversation tremendously, and that means that people don't have the ability to form their own opinion, which fundamentally changes the way how they can make choices about how we should divvy up the world's resources. So everything we do goes back to what is a fact and what is not a fact, and based on that you can have different views and opinions. And I think Sam is envisioned to help people formulate their own opinion based on the same facts. We acknowledge that everyone has a different opinion, and that's fine. But what we see around is people having opinions based on biased facts, or as they say, non-facts these days. And that makes it extremely hard to get together and come to a common understanding of problems and how to solve them.
Yeah, and I think I would add that, politics is inherently biased. If you belong to a political party, then you're biased towards the manifesto of that party. What we're aiming to do is use SAM as a way of gathering facts, understanding sentiment, and using that to understand what people actually think, and let people engage with a virtual politician that isn't biased towards a manifesto of a particular political party.
So in that way, it's kind of like the virtual politician does not have the pressure of re-election. So it's more free to give you the honest answer. So in that way, do you think that it's the better politician than the real politician? Like, does it understand, will it be able to understand the kind of emotions that drive people as well? Like, is that something you're working on too?
I think it's going to take time.
That's extremely complicated to achieve because computers can understand ones and zeros, but sarcasm and cynicism and emotion, in essence, is extremely complicated to figure out. It is derived from the words that are people using, which isn't, certainly in sarcasm, not a representation of their true opinion.
And so the way that we look at it, that maybe there's an interim step, for example, where a human politician has a hybrid, situation where it might have an AI assistant. So Sam might be an assistant to an existing politician, and Sam can provide a role of actually making sure that when they stand up in Parliament and ask a question or they are debating an issue, that they have the best facts available to them. So I think there are lots of ways that this can play out, but I think there's a fundamental value that we're bringing to this, is that politics should be good. It shouldn't be. It doesn't need to be adversarial. It should be focused. It should be representative. A lot of those values have sort of got lost in the way that media covers, political statements and political actions and stuff like that. And it's sort of like it's an opportunity for us to reset it, because actually, if you go back to fundamental principles, every citizen of a country is actually a member of the government. It's just that we can't all be in Parliament at the same time. So we go through a process of appointing a management, committee, and that is the election. We elect people to represent us, who and they have the time to be in Parliament and go through the process and stuff like that. It's like the power really still, in pure principles, vests in the citizen, but the citizen are being disenfranchised. So obviously, the easiest way to address that is through technology.
It's even more than that now, Nick. Like people used to, belong to a community, maybe a city, maybe a nation, but now people belong to the world. There are issues that occur, climate change, as an example, but there are issues that are happening everywhere in the world that affect us all. And we all should be able to engage in it and have some influence over what happens in various countries. Take, for example, the United States. A small country like New Zealand is affected by what the United States or China do with their economic policies or the way that they conduct themselves on the world stage. The elections that occur in those countries are of deep interest to people here in New Zealand, as they are in other smaller countries. We should be able to tell those people in those countries what we collectively think. And at the moment, we're restricted to elected officials who maybe don't represent the way that the vast majority of people are thinking.
So so you're feeding Sam these facts? Like what kind of facts, first of all, are you feeding Sam? And then because of that the global implications that actions like in the United States have, like, will Sam be more of a global thinking AI? So will Sam consider the global implications of national actions, for example?
That's a challenging question. I think we've had that conversation several times. My belief is that Sam should not give someone an answer, but help someone reach their own conclusion about what, in their opinion, would be the best way to approach things. And based on that, formulate an opinion based on all facts about how they would make that decision. That means that when we talk about facts, we need to source our facts from actually all media, so to say. We cannot just say, so we acknowledge, for example, a medium that has more of a progressive approach to life. Therefore, we acknowledge that as a fact, and we discard facts that come from a conservative space, because that would bias everything that comes out of Sam. So the conversation about how do we acknowledge a fact and what do we present as a fact is still an ongoing conversation. And I think that will remain a conversation for as long as SAM will exist, because it's an evolving thing. Facts can occur from different places. And the scope of information you provide someone, whether it's national, regional, or the continent or the planet, I think that highly depends on the ability of a person to process that type of information. Not everyone will be able to process the global scale of things or be interested in it. And what we need to do, I think, is go right to the border of where they are still interested and where they can cope with it. And with that information, provide them the best decision within their little area, however big that is.
And my question. So Sam is more like also an educator. So okay, so he or she combines being an educator and a decision maker as well. So
not so much a decision maker, but an educator and a safe source, a trusted source, someone that you can talk to, irrespective of your level of educational understanding, So again, it's sort of like she or he has the ability to scale with that. That's sort of like our vision, because ultimately it's not our job to tell people what we think the truth is. Our job and our opportunity is to actually enable people to come to their own conclusions. Like Martin says, that's so important, and so what's being missed at the moment in politics around the world is like, it's sort of like sound bites and getting away with a sound bite, and then, someone making a lie or whatever that might get remembered at election time, but probably won't be. And so the whole thing is getting to a point of silliness, and it's sort of like I describe it, it's getting flooded by complexity. To think that we could pass a piece of legislation that's going to try and solve climate change, when in fact we all know that human behavior is what's driving climate change. We have to go to the source, which is what we all do in our lives. So how can we give an individual fact saying, well, if you recycle this, or you don't recycle this, or you use your bike and you don't use your car, this is what it actually means. And this is how on a cumulative basis globally, it can lead to a solution. It's all getting lost in the system. And certainly, again, as I said before, I think we have to accept failure of the current system and its ability to deal with, the issues around climate change. I think also inequality, there's a lot of data now that suggests that actually more equal societies actually perform better for everyone, both in economic terms, but in, and also social and health terms. It's like, so how come we're not moving into that state really, really quickly? Because we've got all these vertical, boxes: health, economy, politics, climate, etc. It's just still a very, 18th, 19th century view of the world.
So Sam would also not be susceptible to lobbyism, and just trying to think of how is Sam, can he or she be influenced by, say?
I think there's always bias. I mean, I don't know who Angela Merkel's having breakfast with this morning, but she'll be having breakfast with someone, and who her meetings is, and what numbers she has on her phone, and who can ring her and who can't ring her. Same in New Zealand, so there's already bias in the system. The issue is it's not transparent. It's interesting to think that if you're a rich person, you can fly somewhere in a jet or whatever, suddenly, government agencies will pay attention to you, so there's a bias in the system. Versus a homeless person, people don't stop and talk to a homeless person on the street. They talk to a billionaire who flies in because he just happens to be, passing through Cologne on their way to their holiday, space in Croatia or whatever it is, So let's be true. There's a huge amount of bias in the current system because it's a human system. What Sam has the ability to do is actually make that bias much more transparent.
So the challenge that we face is that we suspect that it's relatively easy to get funding for a lot of development, but that funding would be extremely biased. So the challenge that we have is getting this up to the next level without compromising the fundamental rule that says SAM should be as unbiased as possible, acknowledging that unbiased doesn't exist.
And with funding, because I mean, I kind of, I've tried to get a project funded too, that didn't work out. But we were talking via email that you might do a global crowdfunding campaign.
Yeah, we've been looking at it. Yeah.
Support, because I think it's so important that it's like a grassroots movement. It comes from the people, because there's so much more legitimacy if we do that. Yeah. So that's
so
one.
I think there are some good models of technology being developed in an open source sort of commons sort of way. Again, there's still a risk of influence, but we're really interested in putting the question out there and saying, look, whoever in the world feels about this issue, has a view on this issue, and wants to play a role in contributing to asking the question and potentially changing the system, then absolutely we welcome it. Just that the fact that the project started in New Zealand doesn't mean anything. It's sort of like the project is a global project. It can be wherever, and certainly we want to make it as impactful as possible.
So will it be like an open source project too? So I don't know how that would work, but will it be available, say maybe like a blueprint or whatever, so other countries can implement it too? Is that the goal, or?
There are several types of models where, say, the originator retains the authenticity of the product, and anyone can copy it to wherever they see fit. But what we need to make sure is that what we create will hold its own ground without having influence from others, and putting a barrier around what we think is valuable, and inviting as many people as possible to provide their ideas and suggestions, and allowing anyone to say, look, I don't agree with this direction, I'm going to spin off, like you see every day in politics as well. I don't agree with party politics this way, so I'm going to split off and set up my own party. And I believe that that's a fundamental right of someone to say, I don't agree, I have something different. And providing that technology for them to do it, that's fine.
So it's also like, obviously, for the kind of the thinking behind it, it can depolarize the public dialogue or the political space. So do you think people will ever be able to vote for SAM, or is it really just on that side of educating and helping people form their political opinion?
I can see some point in the future where the possibility of sort of like voting online is totally viable, and obviously that is a vision that is not our vision. It's been held by a lot of people and science fiction writers, over a long period of time. In a way, I would sort of like flip the question, and it's sort of like it's going to come down to what society wants to do. So if people want to vote online and they believe in the system and they believe in the efficacy of it and the process and then yeah, society should be empowered to go in that process. I mean, at the moment, it's sort of like it's totally fenced off. We can't do it even if we want to do it, and there are lots of examples of campaigns where a lot of public money's been spent to try and generate, local engagement and consultation and stuff like that. And it's the same old people who have time on their hands that write letters to the paper. They're the only ones that respond, so there are lots of examples where the system is actually missing its target right now, but no one's really prepared to admit how bad it really is.
I think one of the questions is, would anyone vote for a bunch of programming code to make decisions for them? And if I talk about that with people, I say, look, we already have a lot of programming code that defines the decisions that we make. Those programming codes are just called the law. And we have very complicated, unreliable computers called lawyers and judges running those programs and saying this is the right outcome and this is not the right outcome. So all of that interpretation of programming code through humans is happening day to day, and it is a flawed system by nature, and we all accept it as being fair and honest. So the expectation we generally have of technology to be flawless is completely wrong. The question is not, is it flawless in its decision making? But the question is, do we accept the amount of flaws that it has? And are those flaws things that we can improve on or accept in general? That's the question. So if you ask me if voting for an AI politician should be possible, I tend to think that certain decisions, not all, but certain decisions definitely could be left to a set of rules generated via AI. Yeah.
And I think what I would add is it's trust is a large component of what we're talking about. So we all know that politicians rank fairly lowly on the spectrum of trust. People today may question whether they would trust programmers to come up with something that was as unbiased as possible. But if you look at more simple things like, say, something like Google Maps, we trust Google Maps to tell us what the direction is that we're going and how long it's going to take us to get. And in the early stages, people didn't really trust that much. It was saying it was going to take you 5 minutes to walk there, and it may take you 8 minutes. And it's like, well, how can I trust this thing? If you ask people today, they have absolute trust in things like Google Maps, and that's how I see this thing progressing as well. If we start from a good place, and we don't introduce significant bias right at the start, when we can build trust with people, it will become a powerful tool very quickly.
So it's about also just accepting that it might take some time, and it will develop, and maybe in the future we'll develop that trust towards an AI politician, but it's a longer process per se.
Yeah,
correct.
So the way that I look at it, you sort of have this concept of a persona. So New Zealand as a society has a particular look and feel to it, and that can be represented in technology, the decisions that are made and how they're made and why they're made and stuff. And every country is similar. Every country has its own particular persona. We call that culture, and we call it our socioeconomic, profile. We have the concepts already in existence, but they haven't been updated. They're not real time. It's a bit like we're still in analog, using not digital technology. So let's actually look at applying digital technology to these concepts that already exist. And how can we take into account and mash together, those nuances and subtleties of language and sex and age and blah, 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 and all that sort of stuff, but sort of create a persona, which is a real-time persona. Because we know that if people wake up in the morning feeling happy, the whole economy and society is much better than if people wake up in the morning feeling sad and grumpy and uncertain and locked in, because of COVID or whatever, so there is, I think this is it's not as science fiction-y as it may seem. There's already, I believe, quite a firm baseline, for us to work from. I guess, we're prepared to actually give it a go and start to, I guess, set out on this journey to explore what this actually might look like and what it might lead to.
So what are your next steps? Like, say you get the funding from the crowdfunding campaign, what's something you would then work on? What's the process for people who don't know about it?
Getting a good understanding. So the first thing is to identify what people are interested in talking about, because if we find something that people are passionate about and want to have more opinion on, I mean, there's a whole range of things that we could cover, but climate change, inequality, those kinds of things, diversity are topics that people are very much interested in. Finding that topic and then starting conversation with people and drawing out what they actually want to hear, and from there on build on what people are talking about and extending it, and trying to apply a learning model to it, to say, look, if people are talking about this, how do we get that embedded into our fact-finding journeys, and then sourcing the facts for those topics. And a lot of the work that will need to be put in is foundations or structures, governance around how do we actually maintain that independence? How do we create something that is not biased, that's not influenced by others as much as we can? So a lot of that will be work that's already going on in the background, thinking about where does that legal structure sit. So I think that would be roughly what we were heading towards, to start that conversation again on the back of what we've learned, and from there on build on what we find as we go on our journey to find it.
And you're just talking about kind of figuring out what the population wants. So you would have real workshops, or will you analyze like social media conversations? How would that process work?
That's probably going to be in the form of an initial design sprint, where you just suss out topics and you include a bunch of people from community, from different areas of the community, where you have everyone pitch in and give their ideas and their concerns, and then just come up with a list of things that you want to start with. I mean, whatever decision you make in that process will be wrong. That's true by definition of the process, because you cannot start a conversation without having that conversation. Just like what we discuss here is not what is an exact answer to your questions. Those questions were actually a means of starting that conversation. And as we went through that conversation, it went in all different directions. We probably covered some of the things that you want to know, but there's a lot more being said, because that's how the conversation evolves. And so you start with something like a design sprint, you suss it out, you put it online, and that's when the work starts. When I describe it to businesses, if I work with them, it's like you get a new staff member. If we're talking about virtual assistants, you get a staff member, you put them behind a desk. If you expect that they will be successful on day one, you don't understand how staff works. The same applies to this technology. You can activate it, you can give it a place, but from that point onwards, you need to manage it, monitor it, train it, help it, support it, coach it, everything it needs to grow and flourish. The same applies to technology as to people. So in that sense, it's actually just raising children, maybe.
Yeah, I read this book by Harari. And he was actually talking about how humans are way better at inventing things than using them. So what do you think are some like challenges when it comes to developing something like that? Where do you see dangers?
Well, I always start off, and it sounds supercilious, but I'm sort of actually real, like, so why can't things be fun? Why can't a politician be your friend? Why can't we, to me, the opportunity is totally reframe it. It doesn't need to be about, polarized processes and arguments and boring facts and stuff like that. Let's reframe it, make it fun and exciting. Let's give it some sort of like forward direction, let people feel like they can participate in it. So I guess there's a degree of gamification, that could flow into this. And again, some people will be more receptive to it than others, and there may be other hybrid, things around the edges that we can do to actually, bring more people into the engagement.
I think one of our initial concerns when we did the first experiment with SAM was that people would be very negative and try and turn SAM into, a racist or, something along those lines. And what we found is that there was huge positive engagement with SAM. We never really encountered any negativity at all. People genuinely wanted to engage and find out answers that they couldn't find out, and understand how politics worked, how they could engage better, what decisions that they needed to make, and get information to help them make decisions.
Let me just look if I have another question that goes in that direction. Oh yeah, the question of kind of transparency. So I think that's obviously one of the, like you said earlier, we don't know exactly who Angela Merkel is having over for breakfast. So how does kind of someone like Sam kind of communicate transparently? Like, will we be able to know how the process works? Like, how do we ensure transparency? And that I don't know much about AI yet, but
there's sort of two levels of transparency, right? There's transparency of who's giving you the money to do whatever you're doing, and then there's transparency in the code and how it's written and the bias of the developers that may be involved, and so on and so forth. I don't know, Nick, do we want to talk about the foundation sort of idea that we have?
I mean, I think it's
So we talked early on about having SAM similar to like Wikipedia, where it was a foundation that people contributed to, and it wasn't like a company that was necessarily just driven towards a profit motive. As with Wikipedia, you have people who contribute who are potentially biased and maybe introduce false facts or whatever. So there have to be a checking type process and all of that sort of thing. But that's how we would address the transparency. That this was not an organization that is driven for profit, and therefore trying to get as much commercial gain as possible. It was more about creating a tool that people could use, and other people could contribute to.
And I think also the layer we have questions and answers, that gets recorded, digitally, and so there's a record. So Sam, as a politician, can't say, I can't remember you having that conversation with me, or I was drunk at the time, or whatever the excuse may be. So that's where there's like a big differentiation with existing politics, where politicians do say, I don't remember saying that, or I don't remember doing that, or whatever. Like, there's basic stuff here where we've effectively created digital record. So a conversation that you might be having with Sam becomes a digital record, so you can see the responses. So again, that's a lot more transparent than the current political practice.
With the caveat of privacy laws.
Yeah, that I was going to ask about that. Data protection is obviously also a very big thing in Europe. So how do we ensure that the data is safe, and that it's not being hacked by a foreign government or something?
I mean, that's all fundamental stuff. And so obviously that's important, and it goes to the trust, issue that Andrew raised, that we have to prove that we are trustworthy and that people engage with us are trustworthy. So obviously, not having a profit motive there also makes it easier. So we're not like, Facebook or some of the other big, properties that are actually driven by returning to shareholders. And so therefore, they won't pay for your information, even though they sell your phone number for $2.50 sort of thing,
Oh God, yeah, yeah. I'm a bit worried that big tech companies will catch on to this, and then I don't know. Do you think that's a possibility that they will try and introduce virtual politicians? Because I've been having this conversation with a few people who they're really worried that the private sector is actually more important than our democratic system. So that kind of power level, how do we ensure that they don't, or they might try and introduce something like that actually big tech companies are all of a sudden the politicians? Yeah.
Well,
you could argue it's already been happening.
Yeah, I was going to say the same thing. You see that with Facebook already, don't you?
I'm trying to ask neutral questions.
Yeah, I think the question is how do we revert back from that position? How do we actually and a lot of that has to do with the responsibility of the individual and their willingness to actually and it's a bit of a dirty word, but do the work to find what is true and what is not. And the amount of people that are still subscribed to a newspaper is astonishingly low. But if you ask someone, would you pay someone else to find out for you what is true and not? Everyone says, yeah, sure. If it's not too expensive, sure. And then if you ask them, but that is a newspaper, would you subscribe to a newspaper? They say, no, I just get my news from Google and Facebook and what have you not. So it's that disconnect of people where they don't see the value of the service being provided because the service is shrouded in something that they know as being cheap and easy and freely available. And that is something that, we've seen here in New Zealand recently, a $50 million investment in research journalism, which hopefully contributes to people being able to independently search for facts and put that back into the community through our normal media channels, and as such, giving them more of those facts through the channels that they already use. But that's we pay for that as a collective, as the country.
So interesting. I could ask you so many more questions, but also, I don't know, it's getting late over there. But do you have, just as a general question, what would Sam look like? Would Sam ever have a face? Like, could I ask you as well if I could interview Sam, which obviously was not yet possible, but will Sam be able to talk, have a face?
Yeah, I think that if you ask any three of us, you will get a description of our life partners.
We have had discussions about that before. So again, I think, there might be the ability to create an avatar, sort of, I guess, look and feel to this potentially. Again, but, we don't want it to be a distraction. So part of that is then countered back. We don't want to make this like a data heavy piece of technology. We want it to be seamless and lightweight. So, you can carry it around with you on your phone or your devices, etc. You can engage with it. It's not going to kill your battery. You can talk to it whenever you want to, 24/7, so sort of like just reframe it. I think again, that this is an area which is interesting, and it may be that starts to go back to answering what I was talking about before about that cultural persona. So it may be that, in New Zealand, we think a politician looks a certain way. In Germany and EU, it might be different, and so you can build those nuances and subtleties, into the project. But this is not a design project. It's more about, creating space for conversation, and making it easy and fun, and just seeing where this ends up, you know.
I think people potentially react to, say, an avatar that, I don't know, has white skin, is a male or a female, differently than if they were to react to just a design that wasn't designed as a human. And I've always seen it more like Hell of 2001 AD, something like that, more so than a human-looking avatar, which I think will skew the responses of people.
So even the name Sam was really chosen because some people can interpret Sam as Samantha, and other people can interpret Sam as Samuel. So it's sort of like, again, we were trying to come up with like a neutral position where people can choose, I guess, the gender that they think that they are engaging with. And it's just really interesting. Some people are absolutely, see Sam as a male, and others absolutely see her as a female. And I think that's really interesting.
Is there anything I forgot to ask you that's really important to you that you want to tell me about?
No, I think you've done a really good job at doing it. I think, again, the key walkaways for us is like, we want to create a space that's empowering. There are no agendas behind this. We're not afraid of technology. We're not afraid of even asking the question that perhaps technology could make a significant improvement on what we've already got. But I guess we're also sounding an alarm that we do not see that the current system, without radical change, really has the ability to deal with the most serious issues. And if we're having honest conversations around this around the world, we'll see that, pretty much everyone is failing around these serious issues, and that's a concern for any global citizen.
Perfect. Thank you so much. That was such an interesting conversation. I can't wait to follow the process and see where it leads. I think it's just a wonderful idea, and I totally agree. I think we need to do way more, and also make sure that technology is actually a positive force. So thank you for kind of working on that we actually profit from it and it makes our system better. That's such I think, great work you guys are doing. So
Great.
thank you so much for taking the time.